All right, so we're gonna get started. Thank you everyone for joining us. I am going to turn it over to Imogen, who is a wonderful graduate student at USC Rossier, to do the introduction. So Imogen, if you would just turn yourself off mute and come on.
Thanks, Shira. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us as we continue the 2021 lecture series in mathematics education. Today we are very excited to visit with Dr. Tonya Bartell from Michigan State University. I'm going to tell you a little bit about this series. The lecture series in mathematics education is sponsored by the Herman Rache Math Initiative and Rossier School of Education, with the goal of highlighting important research targeted at improving teacher effectiveness in mathematics education. We are very thankful to be able to provide access to this series virtually, as we were just discussing, and for our guest speakers and those joining us for being flexible enough to work in this newfound digital space. Today, I'm elated to introduce Dr. Bartell, who will be talking to us about supporting teachers' equitable mathematics teaching, conceptions, critical examination, and a call to action. Tonya Bartell is an associate professor of mathematics education at Michigan State University. She's interested in exploring teaching practices that promote mathematics learning for all students. Her research focuses on issues of culture, race, and power in mathematics teaching and learning. She attends to a particular attention to teachers' development of mathematics pedagogy for social justice and pedagogy that integrates a focus on mathematics, children's mathematical thinking, and children's community and cultural knowledge. After Dr. Bartell finishes, we'll have time for questions. When the time comes, we ask that you put those questions in the chat, and we'll get to as many as we can. Thank you again for joining us, and I will turn it over to Dr. Bartell.
Great, thank you. Just give me a minute to share my screen here. And this is where I ask if you see my family. No, if you see my notes or my PowerPoint.
We see both.
All right, that's what I want you to see. Good afternoon, good evening for me. Before I would begin, I would really like to thank the Herman and Rache Math Initiative and the USC Rossier School of Education, as well as Michael Lawson and Shira Hatterline for their support in getting this series going and for inviting me here today. I'm really pleased to be here. In this talk, supporting teachers' equitable math teaching practices, conceptions, critical examinations, and a call to action, I'm going to share a bit about my work and how I am trying to contribute to a space of understanding ways to support teachers' development of equitable math teaching. More specifically, I'm going to begin by considering my own conceptions of equitable math teaching practices. And I'm then going to share overviews and key findings from some of my work related to teachers' development of equitable math teaching. And in particular, I'm looking at three intersections. First, the intersection of attending to students' mathematical thinking and drawing on students' funds of knowledge. And then second, still this intersection of students' mathematical thinking, but also attending to race. And third, at the intersection of understanding cultural and institutional oppression and the specific application to mathematics and mathematics education. My work generally has implications for math teacher educators, but today I'm also going to look across these studies to consider implications for classrooms and teacher practice, as that is my understanding of part of the focus of this lecture series. And then I will end with a call to action. So if I want to think about how to support teachers in developing equitable math teaching practices, then it's important for me to understand what I think I mean by equitable math teaching practices. And that conception is continuously evolving, but a core component of my understanding includes 9 equitable math teaching practices that my colleagues and I identified as part of a JRME commentary back in 2017. So in the following slide, I'm going to share these 9 practices briefly and provide a little bit more information about those that are central to the work that I talk about later. We see equitable math teaching as teachers establishing classroom norms for participation, positioning students as capable, recognizing multiple forms of discourse and languages as a resource, monitoring how students position each other, pressing for academic success, and supporting students' development of a socio-political disposition. Most relevant to the work that I'm going to share today, equitable math teaching also includes drawing on students' funds of knowledge. And I don't know whether Marta Seville discussed funds of knowledge in her recent talk in this series, but an example of drawing on students' funds of knowledge comes from her work aimed at supporting students learning mathematics through building on community and cultural knowledge and practices in math instruction. Equitable math teaching also includes teachers explicitly attending to race and culture, making connections to students' racial and cultural identities, and recognizing, as well as working against, how certain groups have been positioned as anti-intellectual. And finally, equitable math teaching requires attending to students' mathematical thinking, where teachers recognize, understand, and build from children's understanding of mathematics. So as you might notice, this list is both incomplete and complex at the same time, but the goal, even as these conceptions evolve, is to engage in conversations with colleagues, with you all in the field, so that we can deepen and enrich our understandings. And in such a conversation, for example, Doctors Gregory Larnell and Filiberto Barajas Lopez responded to our JRME commentary in their own commentary, and they really worked to broaden the discourse on race and racism within the context of equitable math teaching practices. And they warn that equity discourse in math education is too easily rendered race neutral or race light, and it's often employed in favor of predominantly white audiences. They also argue in part that the field's conceptualizations of equitable math teaching, particularly with respect to race and culture, must draw on work outside of math education, such as literatures regarding race and culture in sociology, anthropology, cultural studies, identity-centered studies, and so on. Doctors Larnell and Barajas Lopez also pose questions toward a deeper treatment of race and culture for research and practice that I think are relevant to the talk today, including how do we expand our perspectives on research in ways that are more explicit about the roles and hidden effects of white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and other manifestations of racism within the spaces in which mathematics education also operates? And how do we recognize and enliven the bridges to mathematical practices that already exist and are embedded in everyday cultural practices? So I've given you a lot to think about and very briefly, but I would like to hear from you some initial reactions about these central components. What would you add? What do you wonder? What do you question? I've asked Shira to include the Padlet link in the chat. You should be able to go to that link, and there's a little plus sign in the bottom right corner, and you can add your thoughts and comments about this, and I will just wait a few minutes before coming back together. Great, thank you very much for starting to think about this. I really just wanted you to kind of get in the headspace of sort of thinking about if you had to articulate something to other people about what equitable math teaching included, how would it compare to this list, and what things are you wondering as you think about this list? And I look forward to reading these in more detail at the end of the talk. I'm now going to turn to sharing some of my work that has looked more closely at the intersections of some of these equitable math teaching practices. One area of my work has been with the Teach Math project, and specifically sits at the intersection of attending to students' mathematical thinking and their cultural and community knowledge. In fact, the central goal of the Teach Math project was to design and study instructional modules for K-8 math methods courses, and later with early career teachers, that explicitly develop prospective teachers' competencies related to integrating a focus on children's mathematical thinking and children's home and community-based funds of knowledge in their math instruction. In this work, we created and studied 3 modules. I'm first going to just briefly share about the activities that are included in each module, and then I'm going to share some key findings from some of our research around these modules. The Math Learning Case Study module consists of activities that prospective teachers conduct with one particular case study student. They conduct a getting to know you interview that helps them become more familiar with one student's interests, activities, and their home and community resources. They also engage in a problem-solving interview that comes from Carpenter and colleagues' work with CGI, where the prospective teacher practices eliciting, interpreting, and assessing the students' thinking about mathematics. And then at some sites, a shadowing activity was also included to identify the students' competencies across contexts. So in other words, not just in the math setting. And then upon completion of these activities, the teachers make and justify suggestions for future instruction, given what they've started to learn about their case study student. It should also be noted that we ask prospective teachers to choose a case study student that is either been positioned as struggling in mathematics, or who they see as different from them along some dimension, such that they maybe aren't getting to know that student as well as they are others. And then as part of the community math exploration, prospective teachers engage in 2 activities. One is a community walk, and then based on that community walk, they design a math lesson. Small groups, pairs, sometimes larger, of prospective teachers conduct visits in the community surrounding the school or in the community where they know that their students live. And that might include locations like parks and construction sites, corner stores like we see here, restaurants, etc. And during these visits, students look for and document evidence of mathematics. And importantly, they talk to individuals who are working or playing or shopping in the setting about how they are using mathematics or about the nature of their interaction with the setting. And the goal is to identify mathematical practices and mathematical funds of knowledge in the community, and then build on these when designing a math lesson plan for students in the classroom. And then the third module, we call the Classroom Practices module. Teachers engage in a number of activities where they examine various artifacts of practice: lessons, curriculum materials, video clips, lesson plans. And they do this through looking at 4 different lenses. So they'll evaluate a video clip from the perspective of teaching, from the perspective of learning, from the perspective of the math task being implemented, and from the perspective of power and participation. We have a range of prompts that help teachers think about those particular aspects when they engage in these activities. And we've conducted a number of studies across our work on this project, and some of those examine prospective teachers' development through engagement in each one of these modules. I realize that this is not a lot of context to understand or interpret these findings, but my goal here is for you to get a sense of what our research suggests are some of the ways that modules and activities like these can support prospective teachers in developing components of equitable math teaching. So for example, in one of our research studies around the case study module, so getting to know that one student, we found that close interactions with a Black child supported many, mostly white prospective teachers in reframing their interpretations of that child or their communities. So even in a 1 semester, or in some cases 2-quarter course, prospective teachers moved away from the deficit perspectives of Black children and their families that they brought into the methods classroom. And then this positioned those teachers to be able to access those valuable resources and build on them in math lessons. When we look at our teachers' work with the classroom practices module, we found that the use of these 4 lenses when they're watching video clips across the semester scaffolded prospective teachers noticing, moving from early in the semester, mostly attending to specific teaching and learning events. And then at the end of the semester, moving toward awareness and one toward making connections with focused noticing of particular students, particular interactions, analyzing, interpreting, and using evidence to support claims. And finally, let me share the results from the community math exploration lesson plans that we examined. As you can see in the pie chart, the majority of lessons evidenced what we call emerging connections, which we conceptualized as low attention to children's mathematical thinking or low attention to children's funds of knowledge, but not both. Pre-service teachers tended to be focused on one more than the other. We also, though, saw that 27% of prospective teachers, after engaging in this community math module, created what we call transitional lenses, which attended to both children's mathematical thinking and their funds of knowledge at different points throughout the lesson, although it was somewhat inconsistent up and down throughout the lesson. And then 17% of our prospective teachers' lesson plans made strong connections to both children's mathematical thinking and their funds of knowledge throughout the lesson. So overall, looking across our work in the Teach Math project, we found that when we prompted and scaffolded and when we really maintained this integrated focus, prospective teachers can make connections to children's mathematical thinking and their cultural and community funds of knowledge in their math instruction. And this is really promising in thinking about how we can identify ways to support teachers in developing these equitable teaching practices. So Teach Math I see at the intersection of attending to students' mathematical thinking and attending to students' funds of knowledge, 2 of those practices on the list. In the next study that I will discuss about implicit bias, I see this at the intersection of attending to students' mathematical thinking and attending to race. And I know some of you asked in the Padlet, like, I'd like to know more about what attending to race and culture means. This will give you just a little glimpse of one way that we might take that up. In this work, my colleagues and I explicitly examined how racial attitudes related to prospective teachers' evaluations of Black and white students' mathematical thinking. We build on the work of one of your professors here. I hope she's sleeping because it's 2 in the morning in Turkey, Dr. Kurga Genturk, who examined teachers' evaluations of math solutions by race and gender. Our study connects to work like hers, where we also examine the role of bias in math teaching, but we also connect to work on teacher noticing. So we move from using student work as the artifact of analysis to exploring how prospective teachers attend to and interpret videos of different classes. So in particular in this study, we had 99 prospective teachers from 9 public universities across the US. They took a general background questionnaire first when they started the survey, their race, their sex, their age, prior coursework, etc. But we also asked the teachers to rate their frequency and interactions with African American, white, Latinx, and Asian communities on a 5-point scale. We asked about all of the communities because we didn't want to prime them to knowing what the study might be about, but we were really interested and looked at their responses to time in African American communities. We know from social psychology research that the more contact that one has with another group, the more positive their implicit or explicit biases are or attitudes are toward that group. And so we wanted to get a sense of whether that might play a role in how teachers evaluated student thinking in the videos. The survey then continued with a 12-point scale assessing, or 12-question scale assessing teachers' math knowledge for teaching around fractions, specifically focused on equivalence, because that was the mathematical content of the videos that they would be watching. Again, trying to see whether MKT might play a role in patterns that we saw in how teachers evaluated student thinking in the videos. So the next part of the survey involved a pair of videos. all of the teachers rated both videos, but the order in which they viewed those videos was randomized, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. Students in both videos were exploring whether 2/10 was equivalent to 1/5, and they were justifying their responses using Cuisenaire rods, like we see in the picture here. Both classes were taught by the same teacher, but one class included predominantly African-American students and the other class predominantly white students. In both videos, one pair of students shared their thinking. Both pairs solved the problem correctly, and we had these videos watched and evaluated by a number of outside evaluators to say that the thinking in the two videos was comparable. Then following each video, participants were asked to rate students based on the quality of their mathematical explanations, representations, understanding, sophistication, and competence using Likert scale items. And then we asked two open-ended questions for prospective teachers to describe the strategies that they saw students use to solve the problem, and also what they thought was mathematically important in the thinking that the students shared in the video. Students were then locked out of being able to go back and watch the videos. They could watch them as many times as they wanted for this component, but then they were kept from going backwards because we then assessed their explicit racial attitudes and their implicit racial attitudes. And we didn't want them to take these scales and then say, oh, this study is maybe more about race than mathematical thinking. I'm going to go back and change my answers. So together, looking across all of this data, we thought that prospective teachers were well-versed in looking at students' mathematical thinking from a resource perspective, and we didn't expect to find much difference in how they evaluated student thinking for that reason. And we were wrong. These are just brief findings. There's a lot more in the manuscript itself, of course. Prospective teachers generally rated the white student thinking as higher quality than the Black student thinking, even when the math, the problem, the representations, and the explanations were comparable. Prospective teachers also in those open-ended questions used stronger and more positive language when they described the student thinking displayed by the white students as opposed to the Black students. Then when we went in and explored the variables that we thought might impact our results, their implicit and explicit attitude, the time they spent in African-American communities, how many multicultural ed courses they had, none of that was significant. One thing that was surprising to us was the analysis around the ordering of the videos. When watching the videos of the Black class first and the white class second, prospective teachers rated Black students lower than their white peers, which is what I just talked about. But when prospective teachers watched the video in the white-Black order, white class first, Black class second, they scored the Black students even lower. So a couple of things come to mind for us here. Perhaps when viewing students first, viewing white students first, there's a norming effect of the lens through which they viewed Black students reinforces expectations of language, behavior, and mathematical thinking in such a way that they read Black students differently than they would have if they had only seen the video of Black students. Also, even when they exhibited no explicit or implicit racial bias, our test said you don't have any of these biases, PSD still rated white students' mathematical thinking more favorably. This could be an issue with the tests, and we do raise that question, but it also might suggest that teachers are primed societally to evaluate white students' thinking more favorably. And these results really reveal the importance of challenging prospective teachers' explicit and implicit racial attitudes beyond a program's multicultural education courses. And I forgot to say this, but of these 99 prospective teachers, all of them had at least one multicultural ed course at some point in their program, and 95% of them had two. So on the one hand, yes, we want to challenge through there, but this also suggests it's really important to challenge racial bias in ways that are specific to disciplinary practices or specific to math education. So as I noted, I saw the implicit bias study as the intersection of students' mathematical thinking and attending to race. And in the last study I'm going to describe, I find myself in a new space at the intersection of understanding cultural and institutional oppression, which might be related to how we were thinking about supporting sociopolitical dispositions, but not quite how we wrote about it. And the specific application to mathematics education. So not just attending to mathematical thinking, but all of the math teaching practices from that list. Establishing norms, monitoring participation, all of those things are influenced by the way that privilege and oppression is operating in these spaces. So in this last piece that I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to talk about one activity from a larger project, the AIMS project, Access Agency and Allies in Mathematical Systems. Beth Erbel-Eisenman, who I think was also part of this series, was the lead PI on that project. This particular activity took place on the 5th day of a 5-day summer institute, and that summer institute kicked off a 2-year professional development we had with teachers, and the professional development for the summer and the 2 years was a design that included 4 strands: a focus on mathematics, a focus on discourse, a focus on culture and community, and a focus on privilege and oppression. As you can see in this picture, the strands were woven throughout each day of the PD, such that they were integrated into each individual 1-day session, as well as across sessions. And again, the level of oppression activity took place on the last day. And I say this because we didn't just start this activity with no prior work ahead of time. We had a few days of getting to know the teachers. These were full-day sessions from 8 to 4 each day. So the levels of oppression activity, we were hoping that it would help math teachers in understanding multiple levels of oppression and in moving beyond a personal experience lens to seeing oppression as a system. The activity consisted of 2 parts. The first related to education in general, and then the second was grounded in the context of math education, again, trying to get that disciplinary focus. The activity began with a brief introduction with this exact slide of each of the levels of oppression. The personal, interpersonal, institutional, and cultural levels were the ones that we used, and that comes from an MSU extension office. I'm going to go past this slide quickly, but we can come back to it if you have questions. Participants were then each given a statement like these in the table, and there were 14 statements in all. Participants were given a moment to read and think about their statement. And then each math teacher took turns. They read their statement aloud to the group. They shared which level of oppression they felt their statement reflected and why. They could phone a friend, they could ask questions. They all asked one another questions and had a discussion. And then when they felt the discussion ended, they went to stand in an area of the room designated for that level, in a way committing to saying, I think that this statement reflects the what might happen in an interpersonal interaction. The second part of the activity then connected to the math teaching and learning by drawing on an earlier activity that we did during that same week, where teachers identified deficit narratives that they had heard people say about their students or their communities around mathematics education. So one deficit narrative that the math teachers identified was that they heard people say that poor Black students and their parents do not care about math education. So they were then asked to determine what level of oppression they thought this statement would fit, and of the 4, and also to generate statements of how this narrative might play out at other levels of oppression. We also went through an example together before they did this on their own. And then importantly, teachers generated counter narratives and or changes to classroom practices that they would suggest to disrupt this deficit narrative. So our data for our analysis included the audio of the whole group slip sorting, if you will, figuring out where things went, audio of all the small group discussion of this statement and the statements that they would generate in relationship, and then also the audio of them sharing out their ideas from their small groups. Again, a brief glimpse at some findings. levels of oppression activities supported teachers in discussing their understanding of the 4 levels of oppression. The discussion included arguments and rebuttals and justifications and stories, and some of the stories were just really, really poignant. Teachers shared their reasoning, they listened to each other, and often they changed their understanding of a particular level of oppression after they had some conversation with each other. Most of the teachers understood the personal and interpersonal levels in ways similar to the definitions that we provided, but they seem to have less understanding of the institutional and cultural levels. That's not totally surprising because these levels are really moving beyond that focus on personal experience. I also want to note at times the African-American math teachers that were part of this group made contributions that questioned and pushed fellow participants to rethink their ideas. So it must be acknowledged that the work and knowledge and contributions of these African-American math teachers contributed to the overall sense making of the white and other African-American math teachers. And this for us raised questions about what our role as facilitators, math teacher educators could have or should have played with respect to challenging teachers' perspectives so that that burden was not placed on African-American teachers in the group. And there were African-American facilitators as well, but this was something that we noticed in our data. In the paper, we unpack further how math teacher educators might use what we learned in this study about what is both present and absent in teachers' understanding so that we can inform future PD. In our findings, we see a sort of fuzziness in math teachers' conceptions and developing understandings of the levels of oppression. On the one hand, this fuzziness is critical to the process. Some of the discussions wouldn't have taken place otherwise. On the other hand, we worry that this fuzziness unaddressed, say if this was the last day of the PD, might support existing misunderstandings or biases about the way privilege and oppression play out in math ed, which again raises an important question about when and how teacher educators might join math teachers' conversations to make sure that issues of prejudice and discrimination stay at the foreground. As I reach the end of this talk, I consider the work that I presented in light of implications for classroom and teacher practice. As I mentioned, I thought that that was part of what this series was about, and I end with a call to action. Though most of my research has implications for math teacher educators, I do see some implications for classroom and teacher practice. First, I think this research suggests that teachers should engage in activities that support them in getting to know their students and their students' communities in a myriad of ways so that they can learn about the knowledge and mathematical practices that students and community members engage in and draw on those practices in meaningful ways in their instruction. Second, the research shows, as does prior research, that racial bias arises when teachers evaluate students' mathematical explanations. Teachers should acknowledge that bias is a factor operating in the classroom and then consider how they can mediate this in their classrooms and practice. And our research doesn't provide answers, but one thought that comes to mind for me here is whether teachers might analyze the feedback that they provide students and look for patterns, differences in the words that they're using when they're providing feedback to students along lines of race or other lines to see whether and how bias is operating so as to begin to take steps to mediate that. And then third, teachers can and should be supported in thinking about privilege and oppression in the context of math education so that they can begin to translate these understandings into the use of counter narratives and changed classroom practices that support equitable math teaching. So let's return to this partial list of equitable math teaching practices. And as you consider this list, ask yourself the following questions. In which of these areas do you feel confident about your knowledge? In which of these areas do you need to learn and grow? In which of these areas would you like to expand conceptions? What new areas would you like to see? What is the slice that you are going to take towards supporting teachers in developing and implementing equitable math teaching practices? As I reflect on these questions, I would like to close with the following. How might I expand my conception of equitable math teaching practices toward explicit anti-biased math education? Here, I am learning every day from my wonderful colleague, Catherine Ye. And we are thinking about the teaching tolerant social justice standards and what those would look like operating in a mathematics education context. I also reflect on this and say, marginalized populations can't wait for privileged populations to get up to speed. So while we need to do our own work, it also means acting and working toward change while we're learning and supporting those that are, shall we say, farther along in the path and making changes toward just and equitable math education. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So if people want to ask questions, you can either put them in the chat or unmute yourself. And maybe everyone can kind of join me virtually in thanking Tonya for that wonderful presentation.
Dr. Bartell, could you speak a little bit about what you mean in terms of how students position each other?
Yeah, so students had, this comes from like complex instruction research, where students have ideas about one another that come from their social interactions as well as their math interactions. And so when they come into a math classroom or any space, they have and they develop some ideas about who is good at math, who they want to have as their partner in math, who they want to sit by for whatever reason. And so when we think about students positioning in the math classroom and repositioning them in the math classroom, that's where I draw on complex instruction to think about assigning competence to students, where you look at students that are perceived to have low status and you make sure that you are attending to their mathematical thinking and sharing that mathematical thinking in ways that assigns them competence or smartness, so that the other students start to reposition how they're thinking about students in that context. That's one example of how we might be thinking about it.
Okay, and does that align with students in reading circles?
That's a great question. So what I understand from my literacy colleagues is that they still believe really strongly that there's some merit for student learning to having some leveled reading. That is not the case in mathematics at all. Okay. And so we really need to make sure that when we're working, especially with elementary teachers, that we make clear that that sort of tracking or ability grouping in mathematics is not what's best for students. Unfortunately, what happens is, yes, students are positioned as the good student because they're the good reader, and that can transfer over into their math space. So we have to work really hard to keep those spaces distinct, but also, I would say, assign competence in all of those spaces.
Okay.
Which makes it sound like I have answers. I don't have answers.
I'm going to read a question from the chat. How do you feel teachers' education programs are doing in educating prospective teachers in their issues right now? What about in-service providers? Are there any that are doing a good job with these issues at any kind of scale? Are there any policy solutions you can think of to start to bring about these kinds of changes?
Right. When I think about strong teacher ed programs, I think about UCLA's Center X that's been doing this work for a long time. And I do think about Michigan State, University of Michigan, other places in Washington that have really focused on equity and justice as part of their teacher preparation programs throughout. However, we know very little in the field about the impact of that kind of extended focus, and it is still all too often the case that students have a multicultural ed foundations course in their freshman or sophomore year. They take some other classes, they show up in math methods, and they're surprised that we would be talking about these kinds of things in the context of math education. So I would say that we have a long ways to go in teacher education, and yet at the same time, so I'm hopeful At Michigan State, for example, we're redesigning our elementary teacher prep program. And part of that is including a year of multicultural ed foundations courses. It also includes an ethnic studies component. And our students will now major in a grade band of either PK3 or 3-6. And then they will also have an endorsement of either special education or TESOL. So the idea is that we're bringing in these ideas of supporting diverse learners all the way through. We're also going to co-teach our methods courses with 1 credit multicultural ed foundations course colleagues as a way to try to integrate this all the way through. We think this might work, but we honestly don't know. So we need to study that. In service, I'm less sure of folks that are doing this at scale. The closest might be the Algebra Project and their work with groups of teachers. That's what I can think of. Policy solutions to bring about these changes. I think we need to think hard about things like whether we want to say that there are particular dispositions that teachers should have in order to be a teacher. Whether we need to question whether anyone can or should be a teacher, and whether we want to institute that in some way in our admissions policies or in our graduation policies. I'm sure there are others. I can't think of one right now.
Thank you. I always ask the same question for basically every speaker, which is what's the
I knew it was your question, Morgan.
Yeah.
Another question in the chat: how do you monitor how students position themselves? Does position students as capable or press for academic success cover this?
I would argue that positioning students as capable includes thinking about and knowing about how students position themselves, but it's important that I don't know that I would use monitor how students position themselves. I might start with understand and learn how students position themselves. We often don't ask students how they feel they are positioned in the classroom space. And then once we build those relationships and have that knowledge from students, then I think we can start to work together to position them as capable. If I know that they say, like, you know, I'm feeling a little nervous in math class, but you know, you saw me, I'm a great artist, or you saw me do these things the other day, and then I can draw on that as a teacher and make sure that I'm pointing out artistic abilities, visual abilities, and other capabilities that really do support students in engaging in math and helping them see how it is helping them in math. So it's not just so-and-so is good at art. I'm not going to say that in a math class, but I'm going to say something like, look at the way their ability to see this in the visual helped them make these mathematical connections. And then that elevates that status. And I do think that that is also pressing for academic success, because we're making sure that every student is seeing that they are smart and capable in math and that they can and should succeed.
Great, thank you. Next, what lessons can you share with mathematics educators for helping pre-service teachers learn to teach mathematics for social justice? In particular, what can you share about planning lessons and implementing curriculum materials focused towards building a socio-political discussion?
So what a great question. I'm really excited to share, and you may or may not know this, but Corwin Books had a high school book come out last year on high school math lessons. I don't remember the exact title, to address inequities but it's basically a teaching math for social justice at the high school level book. And we are currently in the process of creating 3 additional books, one for early childhood, one for upper elementary, and one for middle school, where we have lessons from teachers where they're already engaged in this work. So when I think about sharing with my future math teacher educators, I'm super thrilled about the fact that one of the things that we can share is what this looks like in practice with different kids and different teachers and different contexts, and hearing from teachers about, here's how I talked to administration before I started that. Here's what I did when a parent asked me this question. Here's why I didn't back down when parents were resisting in these kinds of ways. So I think those examples are really important. And I also think in terms of learning to teach math for social justice and that sociopolitical disposition is that I find a tension between wanting to meet students where they are and getting students to where I hope they will be. So if I have students that really aren't sure they understand what race is, really aren't sure they understand what culture is, I think there's a danger in then saying that we'll spend a lot of time talking about that and we never actually get to the part of changing your classroom practice. So I would argue that we need to focus on the changes and on the big moves and sort of let the rest come along as we go. If that makes sense. Yes, that is the book. Thank you.
Yeah. And we have some good people on the chat who are, if you're interested, who are looking up links for the book.
Yes, and the Rethinking Math, both volumes are absolutely fantastic. Same. They work really well together.
Great. So next question, do you believe that if teachers understood how students perceive their own abilities in math, that would make any notable change in the data? And I assume that means student achievement data, is that right? Yeah, no, that's good.
So I do. I say this for a few reasons. As much as I want to change the idea that there is or is not math people, that narrative is still really prevalent in society. And so one way to combat that, I think, is for students to recognize, like, I am smart in math in these ways, and I do have these abilities. And that might give them confidence then in engaging in more math tasks, in talking to their peers about mathematics. Whether or not it helps them with tests, I don't know if I want to go that far yet, because a lot depends on the nature of the test and sort of the context there. But I think we would definitely see a difference in terms of students' perseverance in mathematics and seeing themselves as mathematical thinkers and doers. Changing in the findings. I don't know that I have research that can point to this. Maybe the work that I start to think of is the work of Joe Bowler and Railside Schools, and how students in those classrooms engaged in problem-solving mathematics and really saw themselves as doers of mathematics in those spaces. And there were differences on achievement levels and differences in the findings there when students were engaged in those kinds of math tasks, and when they were also assigned competence and positioned in ways that showed them that they were smart and skillful in math.
What if I don't see any others in the chat? What do teachers struggle with the most here?
Of the practices?
Yeah. Or I guess of the practices, maybe, and or of the process of kind of engaging in this as well.
Teachers come to teaching thinking it's going to be about kids and it's going to be about math. So they're pretty good with anything like attending to students' mathematical thinking, or thinking about discourse moves, or thinking about how they're positioning students in small groups or group-worthy tasks. The resistance, as you might predict, the difficulty comes in when we start to talk about things like sociopolitical disposition, when we start to talk about things like racial bias, and that matters in our interactions with students in math classrooms in particular ways. Then they're like, wait a minute, this is not what math teaching about. This is then all of the stuff comes out about, I don't see color, I'm neutral, we shouldn't talk about politics. And so that takes a different kind of commitment, I think, by the students, and then not more work, but continued work on the part of teacher educators over time.
Great. Another question, does seeing all students as being capable math thinkers presuppose that teachers see themselves as being capable?
Great question. Richard. It might. I don't mean it to, but it might. And we definitely know that teachers don't all see themselves as capable. In particular, I work with elementary teachers, and they often don't see themselves as capable mathematical thinkers and doers. I do think there is a connection there. I have seen teachers who believe that they're not strong mathematical thinkers still employ these practices to try to bring out students' competencies and strengths. They aren't always successful, which I mean, I'm working with prospective teachers, so I don't expect them to always be successful. But one of the things that happens is they also start to realize that maybe they're smarter in math than they thought, because math is defined in broader ways. Math is not just about speed and efficiency. Math is about all of these other things. You can be smart in these different ways, and then they say, well, wait a minute, I'm actually really good at these 5 things. And you're telling me that those are really helping me in problem solving in math, and we can unpack that. And then they're able to feel differently about their perspectives towards math and their perspectives towards themselves as doers of math. But I think, Richard, that's an interesting question. I'm going to think about that some more.
The next one, if it's important to attend explicitly to race and culture, is it also important to make sure race is not made synonymous with a perceived culture?
Absolutely. And if we could do it over again, we wouldn't put them in the same line. We wouldn't talk about them at the same time, because there's already too much conflation between race and culture, and they are not the same. We are not talking about the same thing. And so in the paper, we try to tease that out. In the commentary from Greg Larnell and Filiberto Barajas Lopez, they do an even better job of calling us out on that and saying we can't use these terms together in the field because of the consequences that we have. So yes, absolutely, we have to make sure that race is not made synonymous with culture, and that we understand how they operate differently and how they're responded to differently in math contexts and spaces. Thank you for that question.
How can this sort of training be made available to teachers and staff who work in disadvantaged school districts that may need it the most?
Another good question. The way that we have been able to work with some of the most disadvantaged school districts is we get funding, and then we're able to support our work, and we're able to support the schools. I think we really need to consider what that means broadly. We chose to work with disadvantaged school districts that, we drove an hour and a half further than we might have needed to if we had just stayed in our comfy little place in East Lansing. I'm hopeful now that we've made this turn to Zooming everything. I'd like to think that we can make these kinds of things just more widely available to larger groups of people, that is at a different level of cost. And so there might be ways to think about that as well. There are some relational components that are definitely lost interacting via Zoom versus face-to-face and having some of those communal moments. But I think that, yeah, part of it also is we have to do the work without asking for unreasonable sums of money to do so. I guess that's my perception, is that a lot of the PD work that I see available to districts is really expensive, and it's like consulting firms, and that's really only available to some districts.
Maybe we have time for one more question if anyone has burning. Maybe that was we ended on that. That was a practical question is always a good one to end on. So I want to thank everybody for joining us, and thank mostly Dr. Bartell for a really wonderful lecture. Yeah, I see some people clapping. I think maybe we're all doing it virtually, if not.
Thank you.
And thank you so much. And please join us also for our next lecture is going to be on December 3rd with Dr. Chandra Orel, and that's at 3 o'clock. So please sign up for that in the same space. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.